Summer of 1945. A cold room somewhere in occupied Germany. Across the table from an American army historian, a captured German general lights a cigarette with hands that still remember command. He has been asked, like dozens of his fellow officers that summer, a single question that the historians have begun to expect a single answer to. From senior officers and from commanders pulled from the wreckage of the Wehrmacht, from men who had once given orders that moved divisions across the map of Europe, the same question again and again. Of everything in the American arsenal, of every weapon that crossed the ocean and broke your front and ended your war, what impressed you the most? The Sherman tank, the Thunderbolt fighter bomber, the naval guns that turned coastlines into craters, the B-17s that darkened entire skies, the atomic bomb that ended the Pacific. The general thinks. He always thinks, then he answers. Not the tank, not the plane, not the bomb, the jeep, a small open-top vehicle no bigger than a workshop bench, no armor, no cannon, no machine gun mounted on the hood. 60 horsepower, a top speed of 50 miles per hour on a good road and not on a bad one. The United States Army paid $738 for each one. Less than a mid-range piano, and the man who drew the first one had done so in 2 days, working for free at a company on the edge of bankruptcy. For an army that did not yet know what it wanted, his name was Karl Probst. He was 57 years old, a freelance engineer from Detroit, and no one had heard of him. No one would hear of him for decades after the war ended. This is his story, but it is also the story of something much larger. It is the story of why Germany, the most professionally trained, most tactically gifted army of the 20th century, lost the war in the West, not because its tanks were weak, not because its soldiers were untrained, not because the men in field grey uniforms lacked courage. They had all of those things. They had Tigers and Panthers and the 88mm gun. They had Rommel and Manstein and Guderian. What they did not have was time. And in the summer of 1940, more than a year before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, an unknown engineer working at a borrowed drafting table in a small town in Pennsylvania began to build the machine that would take time away from them. The morning of July 17, 1940 was hot and unremarkable in Butler, Pennsylvania. Butler was a small industrial town north of Pittsburgh, the kind of place where the fortunes of one factory could rise or fall the fortunes of a whole community. And the factory that mattered most in Butler that summer was dying. The American Bantam Car Company employed fewer than 500 workers. Its products, small lightweight automobiles licensed from British designs, had never found a serious market in a country that preferred its cars heavy and chrome-plated. The company's debts were mounting. Its order book was almost empty. Within a year, perhaps two, the lights would go out for good, and then the telephone rang. The call was from Washington. The United States Army Quartermaster Corps had a problem and a deadline. The Army needed a new vehicle, a light, four-wheel drive reconnaissance car for an infantry that was beginning to motorize but had not yet finished the job. The specifications had been written by men who clearly understood what they wanted, but did not understand whether what they wanted was physically possible. The vehicle had to weigh less than 1,300 pounds. It had to carry 3 soldiers and a mounted machine gun. It had to have four-wheel drive, sustained off-road capability, and the durability to survive combat. And a working prototype, running, tested, ready to drive, had to be delivered in 49 days. The Army had sent the specifications to 135 vehicle manufacturers across the country. Every major name in American automotive engineering had been asked. General Motors, Studebaker, Hudson. The men who built the world's most sophisticated cars looked at those specifications and shook their heads. 1,300 pounds was an absurd weight limit for a vehicle that needed four-wheel drive. The drivetrain alone would eat half the budget. The physics, the engineers said, would not permit it. 134 companies said no. Bantam said yes. The decision was less brave than desperate. Bantam was bleeding. A government contract, any government contract, was a lifeline. The board approved the bid in a meeting that lasted minutes. The cable went back to Washington that afternoon. "We can do it," the cable said. "We will deliver in 49 days." There was only one problem. Bantam did not have an engineer capable of designing the vehicle. The man who could design it lived 300 miles away in Detroit. His name was Karl Probst. He was 57 years old, a freelance consultant who had spent his career bouncing between automotive companies, taking contracts where he found them, never famous, never wealthy, never attached to any institution for long. He was the kind of engineer that the great names of Detroit called when they had a problem they could not solve in-house, quietly, without credit, for modest fees. Bantam's plant manager, a man named Harold Christ, picked up the telephone and asked Karl Probst if he could come. Probst asked when. Christ said yesterday. Probst drove through the night. He left Detroit late on July 17th and arrived in Butler the next morning, exhausted, still wearing the day before's shirt. He sat down at a borrowed drafting table in a borrowed office at a company he had never worked for. He had not signed a contract. He was not being paid. He had no guarantee that anything he produced would ever be used. He had only his pencil, his slide rule, and a sheaf of empty paper. He started drawing anyway. What drives a man to work for free at a dying company on an impossible deadline for an army that has not yet decided it needs the vehicle? Probst left no diary entries to answer that question. He gave no interviews about that summer, then or later. We know only what he did. He saw a problem. He believed he could solve it. The paperwork could come afterward. The credit, if any came, could come later. He was an engineer. He had been called. In 2 days he had a complete design. The specifications the army had handed out had been called impossible for good reason. £1,300 was a ruthless ceiling. Every component had to justify its existence in grams. Probst stripped the design to its bones. He borrowed where he could, axles from existing trucks, gears from off-the-shelf catalogues. A 4-cylinder Continental engine that was already in production. He shaped the body as flatly and simply as a kitchen tray. Every curve cost weight, so there were no curves. Every door cost weight, so there were no doors. The roof cost weight, so there was no roof. What emerged on the page was almost brutally ugly. A flat hood. A squared-off body. An open top, a tall windshield that folded forward, a spare tire bolted to the back. It looked like something a child might draw if the child had been told to design a truck and had been given only a ruler. It also weighed exactly what it needed to weigh. The Bantam team built the prototype in 49 days. They worked nights, they worked weekends, they shaved minutes off the schedule. In late September of 1940, with hours to spare on the deadline, Karl Probst and Harold Christ climbed into the hand-built vehicle and drove it themselves, the entire 170 miles from Butler, Pennsylvania to Camp Holabird, Maryland. They arrived ahead of schedule. The army tested the vehicle for weeks. Steep hills, deep mud, stream crossings, sustained highway runs at top speed. The Army's report on the prototype contained, in its most important section, 4 words that mattered above everything else: ample power, all requirements. The Army looked at the Bantam prototype and made a decision that would alter the course of the Second World War. They said, "We need 640,000 of these." Bantam could not build them. This is the part of the story that almost no one tells. Bantam had designed the vehicle. Bantam had delivered the prototype on time, underweight, exceeding every specification. By the rules of fair business and ordinary justice, Bantam should have received the contract to build 640,000 units. The company would have been saved. Karl Probst would have been wealthy. That is not what happened. The Army looked at Bantam's tiny factory in Butler and saw what it actually was. A struggling shop with fewer than 500 workers, no capacity for true mass production, no supply chain capable of supporting a war that would consume vehicles by the hundreds of thousands. The Army needed millions of components, an industrial machine that could outproduce the entire German Reich. Bantam could not do that, so the Army took Karl Probst's blueprints and walked them down the road. They handed them to Willys Overland in Toledo, Ohio. They handed them to Ford in Dearborn, Michigan. Willys looked at Probst's design and made one critical change. They threw out the Continental engine and installed their own 4-cylinder power plant, a 60-horsepower unit that the company called the Go Devil. The Go Devil produced more torque, more power, and more reliability than the engine in Probst's original Bantam. The Army tested the modified Willys version, approved it, and gave it the designation Willys MB. Ford received license to build an identical version called the GPW. These are the vehicles you have seen in every photograph from the Second World War, the jeeps on the beaches of Normandy, the jeeps on the road to Bastogne, the jeeps in MacArthur's South Pacific. Every one of them was a Willys MB or a Ford GPW. Every one of them was built from a design that Karl Probst had drawn at a borrowed table in 2 days in the summer of 1940. And every one of them was built without him. Bantam received a small consolation contract. The company was paid to build the trailers that the jeeps would tow. It was the kind of work that kept the lights on for a few more years, and then no longer. American Bantam Car Company ceased manufacturing automobiles after the war and was effectively finished. Karl Probst received only a modest sum for his design work, $200 for the initial drawings, no royalty, no equity, no share of what was to come, $200. For the vehicle that would become the single most numerous military vehicle in American history, he never received public credit during his lifetime. He returned quietly to Detroit when the work was done and went back to taking the kinds of contracts he had always taken. In the years that followed, 640,000 jeeps would roll off the assembly lines at Willys and Ford, one vehicle every 90 seconds at peak production. They would land on every continent where the war was fought. German generals, sitting in interrogation rooms across occupied Germany in 1945, would name the jeep ahead of every other weapon they had faced. And the man who drew it would be remembered by almost no one, but none of that explains what the jeep actually did. A vehicle is not a weapon because it is small, or because it is cheap, or because it can climb a hill. A horse can climb a hill. A bicycle is cheap. The jeep did something else, something deeper, something that would make a German field marshal in the autumn of 1944 write a sentence he would never have been able to write 4 years earlier. He wrote that the Americans were not just faster than the Wehrmacht, he wrote that they were operating on a different timescale entirely. To understand what he meant, we have to leave Butler, Pennsylvania, and Karl Probst's drafting table and the borrowed office where it all began. We have to follow a single jeep across the English Channel on the morning of June 6, 1944, into the worst place a soldier could be on that day. And we have to understand what the jeep carried in its back seat. It was not a soldier, it was not a rifle, it was not a box of ammunition. It was something far more dangerous. The jeep carried a radio. That was the secret. That was the thing that turned a small, ugly, open-topped vehicle into the most dangerous machine on the European battlefield. Not the wheels, not the engine, not the four-wheel drive that could climb a Norman hedgerow or splash through a Belgian stream. A radio. A compact field set, the SCR 510 or the SCR 610, mounted on a metal frame behind the driver's seat, a handset, a wire to the antenna, a battery, that was all. But to understand why that radio was the most important piece of equipment in the United States Army, you have to first understand a lie that has been told for 80 years. A lie that every American who served in the Second World War saw with his own eyes, but that the history books still struggle to explain. Picture the Wehrmacht. Close your eyes if you have to. What do you see? Panzer columns rolling across Poland, Tiger tanks grinding through Russian mud, Rommel's Afrika Korps slicing through the desert. The word everyone uses is blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it conjures an image of a fully mechanized, fully motorized army of the future. Steel and fire and speed, moving as one unstoppable force across the map of Europe. That image is almost entirely false. Here is the number that changes everything. Of the 322 German Army and Waffen-SS divisions that existed in November of 1943, only 52 were armoured or motorized, 52 out of 322. The rest, more than 80% of the entire German military, moved on foot. Their rifles were carried on the shoulders of men who had walked from Berlin to the gates of Moscow. Their artillery was pulled by horses, their ammunition came forward on horse-drawn wagons, their wounded were carried on horse-drawn litters. The German army entered the war with 514,000 horses. By 1943, that number had more than doubled. Throughout the entire conflict, the average strength of horses in German service was approximately 1,100,000 animals, 1,100,000 horses. More horses than the United States had soldiers on European soil at the time of the Normandy landings. A standard German infantry division went to war with roughly 5,500 horses attached to it. When that division needed to move, it moved at 4 miles per hour in good weather. It moved more slowly in rain, and it did not move at all when the horses were dead. Meanwhile, a single American infantry division, not an elite formation, not an armored spearhead, just a regular infantry division, possessed roughly 1,400 motor vehicles, trucks, ambulances, weapons carriers, command cars, and jeeps. Hundreds of jeeps. The gap between these two armies was not a gap in courage. The German soldier of 1944 was the equal of any rifleman who has ever lived. The gap was not in training. German junior officers were among the finest combat leaders of the 20th century. The gap was not in equipment quality. The 88mm gun was the finest dual-purpose weapon of the war. The Tiger tank could destroy any Allied vehicle on the field. The gap was something far more fundamental. It was a gap in time. German messages traveled at the speed of a horse. American messages traveled at the speed of a radio mounted in a vehicle that could go anywhere at any time, driven by a sergeant who did not need permission to move. That difference, that specific, precise difference, is what killed the Third Reich's ability to defend Western Europe. To see what that meant on a battlefield, picture a 23-year-old American lieutenant on a ridge in Normandy. He is wearing a wool-field jacket that is too warm for the June afternoon, and he has a pair of binoculars in one hand and a radio handset in the other. He sees a German column forming in a tree line 800 yards away, half-tracks, 2 assault guns, perhaps 50 men preparing to move forward. He reads 6 digits off his map. A grid coordinate. He speaks those 6 digits into the handset, calmly, as though he were ordering breakfast. He gives a brief description of the target. He releases the handset key. 3 minutes later, every howitzer in his battalion is firing at that coordinate. If the target is significant enough, every gun in the entire division fires simultaneously on the same spot. Dozens of artillery pieces dropping high-explosive shells into a space the size of a small park. The first rounds land before the German column has moved 200 yards. The Germans had artillery too. Excellent guns. But the German forward observer did not have a jeep. He walked. When he needed to relocate to see a new sector of the battlefield, he moved at the speed of his legs. When he found a target, he sent a runner or used a field telephone connected by wire laid by hand across open ground that was often under fire. By the time his message reached the battery, the American unit he had spotted was already somewhere else. The American observer drove. When the infantry advanced, he drove forward with them. When the situation changed, he drove to a new position in minutes. He carried his communication with him. He did not wait for wire to be laid. He did not send runners. He spoke, and shells fell. Now multiply that one lieutenant by every American infantry battalion in Normandy. Then add the cavalry reconnaissance squadrons ranging 15 and 20 miles ahead of the main force, every one of them mounted on jeeps, every one of them carrying a radio. Then add the company commanders, driving back to battalion headquarters for face-to-face coordination and driving back to their men, a round trip that in a German division required a motorcycle courier and most of a day. Then add the medical evacuation. Jeeps with stretchers strapped across the hood, carrying wounded men to aid stations in 12 minutes that would have taken a stretcher team 2 hours to walk. Then add the wire-laying jeeps, the ammunition jeeps, the supply jeeps, the command jeeps with map boards mounted on the hood and senior officers leaning over them in the wind. This is what a German artillery officer was looking at on the morning of June 7th, 1944, when he pressed his binoculars so hard against his face that they left marks on his skin. Not tanks. Tanks he could understand, tanks he could fight, small, ugly, square-bodied vehicles pouring off the beach, going in every direction at once, stopping, conferring, moving again. Some carrying radios with antennas whipping in the sea wind, some carrying officers with grease pencil maps, some pulling reels of telephone wire that unspooled behind them as they drove. By mid-morning he had counted more than 100 of them. By noon, twice that. By the third day of the invasion, more than 12,000 vehicles had landed in Normandy. The jeep was the single largest category among them, and every one of those jeeps was doing something different. Reconnaissance pushed forward faster than German units could redeploy to meet it. Artillery observers moved to new positions within minutes of an infantry advance. Wounded men reached aid stations alive. Company commanders drove to battalion for the kind of face-to-face conversation that could not be replicated by radio, the kind of conversation that solved problems in minutes that would otherwise have required hours. Every American unit was doing multiple things simultaneously, things that German units could not do at the same speed. This is the part of the story that German generals would struggle to explain in their interrogations the following year. They had no language for it. They had been trained in a tactical school that thought in terms of fronts and reserves and flanking maneuvers. The American army was not moving in fronts. It was flowing. A jeep found a gap in the hedgerows, and within 20 minutes an infantry platoon was through it. An observer in another jeep called fire on the German position that was supposed to guard that gap. A third jeep carried the company commander forward to see the new ground himself. The defenders, waiting in their positions for an attack from the front, discovered that the Americans were already behind them. One German officer put it in writing with a precision that no American military theorist could have matched. He wrote that the jeep gave every American unit the mobility that the Wehrmacht had achieved only with its elite mechanized forces. "We could not establish a continuous front," he wrote, "because the Americans simply drove around our positions." And then, on August 1st of 1944, the situation got dramatically worse for the Germans. That morning, in a muddy field in northern France, Lieutenant General George S. Patton took command of the United States Third Army. Patton was 58 years old, a career cavalryman, a man whose family had fought in every American war since the Revolution and who had spent his life preparing for exactly this moment. He walked to a map, looked at the hole that Operation Cobra had just punched through the German line near Saint-Lô, and gave 4 words to his Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay. "We are going through." Gay was 50 years old. He had been Patton's Chief of Staff for years. He had prepared the contingency plans. The reconnaissance teams were already probing ahead. The road routes had been mapped. The radio frequencies were assigned. What followed was the most spectacular sustained advance in American military history. In the first 2 weeks of August, Third Army covered 250 miles. In 30 days it covered 400. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the banks of the Moselle River on the German border, Patton's forces moved so fast that they routinely overran German headquarters before the officers inside knew the front had shifted. Supply dumps captured intact, communications centers seized before warnings could be sent. German commanders on the receiving end described an experience they had no framework to process. They would receive reports that American forces were 20 miles to the west. They would begin organizing a defensive position. Then jeeps would appear behind them, to the east. The front was not a line. It was a cloud moving in every direction simultaneously. One German regimental commander wrote a sentence in his after-action report that has stayed in the historical record for 80 years. He wrote, "By the time we understood where they were somewhere else entirely. Now here is the part of the story that almost no one tells. The Germans understood what was happening to them. That fact alone deserves to be sat with. They were not fools. They were not blind. They were not slowly waking up to a tactical surprise. They captured jeeps. They drove them. They tested them. They put them on lifts and disassembled them, axle by axle, gear by gear, electrical fitting by electrical fitting. They wrote technical reports. Pages of careful, professional German engineering analysis of every component of the American light reconnaissance vehicle, and those reports reached a single conclusion, that German engineers had to put into words in a language that does not lend itself to surrender. The conclusion was that their own equivalent vehicle, the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, was inferior to the Jeep in every meaningful measurement. The Kübelwagen had 22 horsepower, the Jeep had 60. The Kübelwagen had rear-wheel drive. The Jeep had four-wheel drive. The Kübelwagen had less ground clearance, less torque, less reliability over rough terrain, less ability to ford water, less ability to climb a steep grade. It was, by every metric that mattered in war, the wrong vehicle, and here is the second number that explains everything else. Germany built approximately 50,000 Kübelwagens across the entire war, across all production sites. Across 6 years of total mobilization, 50,000, the United States built 640,000 Jeeps. America was producing one Jeep every 90 seconds at peak production. Germany would have required 12 years to match what the United States produced in 3. The Kübelwagen was assigned to officers and specialists. It was a privilege of rank. The Jeep was given to everyone, to sergeants, to corporals, to privates with a driver's license. The American Army did not ration mobility, it distributed it like water. And here is the part that German engineers could not write in their official reports, but that every senior officer in the Wehrmacht knew by the autumn of 1944. They could not solve the problem. It was not a problem of design. They had the design, more or less. It was not a problem of doctrine. They understood what the Americans were doing and why it worked. It was a problem of industrial capacity. The German war economy, even at its peak, could not produce vehicles at the rate of the American war economy. America had Detroit, America had River Rouge, America had assembly lines that had been refined for decades by men named Ford and Sloan and Knudsen. Germany had a magnificent army and a constrained industry. America had a competent army and an unlimited industry, and in a war that measured success in vehicles per hour and decisions per minute, the unlimited industry was going to win. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, 68 years old, recalled to command in the West in September, reviewed the intelligence summaries and sent a message to Hitler that contained a sentence no German general would have dared write in 1941. He wrote that the fundamental problem was not firepower or numbers but velocity, that the American army operated at a decision speed the German system was structurally incapable of matching. Hitler ignored him. Hitler was already planning the Ardennes offensive, and worse than ignoring him, Hitler gave the order that would make everything else worse. He ordered that German forces hold every position to the last man, that no commander could withdraw without explicit permission from Berlin, that any retreat without authorization would be treated as treason. The order, which had already ended the careers and lives of more than one German general, meant that the slow German command system was now also a paralyzed German command system. A regimental commander who saw American jeeps appearing behind his position could not pull back. A division commander who knew his line had been outflanked could not authorize a withdrawal. They had to send messages up a chain of command, wait for those messages to reach a Führer headquarters that was processing dozens of similar messages from every front, and wait for a reply that would come, if it came at all, hours or days after the situation had already collapsed. Field Marshal Walter Model, 53 years old, the man Hitler called his fireman for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts on the Eastern Front, sent a message to Berlin on August 24, 1944. It was one of the most honest documents produced by any German commander in the entire war. He wrote that the front could not be stabilized by conventional means because the American rate of advance exceeded the German rate of reaction. By the time a defensive position was organized, the Americans had already passed through it. Hitler's response was to order Model to hold every position to the last man. Model knew what that meant. His army was not losing ground because it was fighting poorly. It was losing ground because its nervous system was too slow. That was when Hitler, increasingly desperate, summoned a man whose name had been famous in the German press for more than a year, a man who specialized in the impossible. SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny was 36 years old in the autumn of 1944. He was an Austrian by birth, a giant of a man with a dueling scar that ran the length of his left cheek, and he had become a national hero the year before when he led a glider commando raid that rescued Benito Mussolini from a mountaintop prison in the Italian Apennine. Churchill, in private, had reportedly admired the operation as the one piece of German daring he genuinely respected. Now Skorzeny was handed a different kind of problem. The Germans had studied the Jeep. They had captured hundreds of them. Scorzeny had read the technical reports. He understood, as well as any German officer alive, what the Jeep meant and what it was doing to the Wehrmacht. But he also understood something that the engineers had missed. The Jeep's deepest power was not in its engineering, it was in its ubiquity. A Jeep at a crossroads was invisible because Jeeps were everywhere. No one questioned a Jeep, no one stopped a Jeep. A Jeep driven by men in American uniforms behind American lines could go anywhere, do anything, see anything, before anyone realized something was wrong. He called his unit Panzer Brigade 150. He requested 150 captured American Jeeps. He received fewer than a dozen, a fact that was by itself one of the most revealing statistics of the entire war. The United States was building that many Jeeps every 12 minutes. Germany, after years of combat across 2 continents, could not accumulate 150 of them. Scorzeny's commandos spent months in preparation at a facility outside Berlin. They watched American films to study accents. They practiced the loose, casual American salute, so different from the rigid German style. They learned which hand Americans used to hold a fork, because the European grip was different, and a single meal in the wrong company could mean a firing squad. They rehearsed how Americans walked, how they sat in vehicles, how they lit their cigarettes. Every detail was practiced, every detail mattered. Operation Grafe launched on December 17, 1944, the second day of the Ardennes offensive. Small teams in American uniforms, driving captured jeeps with the white star on the hood faithfully reproduced, slipped through gaps in the fractured American line. Some reached their targets, wire was cut, road signs were reversed. False orders were delivered to American officers who had no reason to doubt the men in their own uniforms. One team misdirected an entire American regiment by reporting a German attack from a direction where no Germans existed. For a day and a night, the deception worked. For roughly 36 hours, the American nervous system, the nervous system that had broken the Wehrmacht across France, was being slowly poisoned from inside. And then, on the morning of December 18th, near a small Belgian town named Iwai, a military police checkpoint stopped a single jeep. 4 men in American uniforms, convincing accents. Identification papers that looked correct at first glance, the kind of vehicle that the MPs at the checkpoint waved through dozens of times every day. But something was off. The MPs asked for the password. The challenge was a single word that changed every 24 hours. The countersign was a different word paired with it that every American soldier in the theater was supposed to know. That day's pair was flash and thunder. Either word demanded the other in reply. The men in the jeep did not know the password. One of them, asked where he had been resupplied that morning, said he had taken on petrol at a depot down the road. Petrol, the British word for gasoline. A word that, in the tense silence of that checkpoint, sounded just wrong enough to a careful MP. A word that a German commando, trained in English by tutors who had learned the language in London or in pre-war Berlin classrooms, had not thought to change. The MPs ordered the 4 men out of the jeep. They searched the vehicle. They found German weapons, explosives, swastika armbands folded under the seat. Under interrogation, one of the captured commandos, an Unteroffizier named Manfred Pernas, stated something that would set the entire European theatre on fire. He stated that part of the Operation Grafe mission was to capture or kill General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. The Allied High Command went immediately into a state that can only be described as institutional panic. Checkpoints appeared on every road, every jeep was stopped, every driver was questioned. Generals were pulled from their vehicles at gunpoint. MPs demanded answers to questions only a real American could answer. What is the capital of Illinois? Who pitched for the Yankees in the '43 series? What is the name of Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? Eisenhower was confined to his headquarters under armed guard. Couriers refused to move. Reconnaissance jeeps that should have been ranging 20 miles ahead of the front stopped instead at the first checkpoint they came to and waited. For 72 hours, Operation Grafe accomplished what no German armored division had managed in months. It slowed the American nervous system. Jeeps stopped moving freely. Decisions that should have taken minutes took hours. the circulatory system of the entire Allied army clogged, and the Germans, for the first time since the breakout from Normandy, had a brief window in which they could move on roads without being immediately spotted, called in, and shelled. But the window was small. 3 days. 3 days in which to do what 80 Wehrmacht divisions could not do for the rest of the war. Pernas, along with the other 2 captured commandos in his team, Günther Billing and Wilhelm Schmidt, was tried by military commission. The verdict was never in doubt. They had been operating as spies behind enemy lines while wearing the uniforms of the army they were fighting. The penalty under international law was clear. All 3 men were executed by firing squad at Henri-Chapelle in occupied Belgium on December 23, 1944. They were the first of 18 Operation Greif commandos who would be put to death before the war ended. Operation Greif officially collapsed, but the damage was done. The Allies had been shaken. The Germans had bought themselves a brief, expensive window of darkness. And in that window, while American MPs were demanding that field marshals name the second baseman of the Brooklyn Dodgers, 250,000 German soldiers and hundreds of tanks were pushing west through the worst winter Europe had seen in 30 years. The Ardennes offensive was about to encircle the most lightly defended position in the entire American line, a small Belgian crossroads town named Bastogne, garrisoned by paratroopers who had been pulled from rest with no winter clothing and no time to dig in. And in a muddy field outside Nancy, France, 300 miles to the south, an American general was about to be summoned to a meeting at Verdun and told to do something that every other commander in the room believed was physically impossible. He would promise to do it in 48 hours. He would not be lying. And the reason he would not be lying had everything to do with men in jeeps who had already done the work 3 days before he ever walked into that room. Verdun, France, December 19, 1944. 3 days into the worst crisis the Allied command had faced since the Normandy invasion. The room was small. The map was large. General Dwight Eisenhower sat at the head of the table. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who commanded the northern flank, was not present. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley sat to one side. Lieutenant General Jacob Devers sat to the other, and across the table from Eisenhower, leaning forward over the map, was Patton. Eisenhower spoke first. He said the German offensive in the Ardennes had to be stopped, and stopped now. He said that the Allied lines had been torn open, that an entire American corps was in danger of being cut off, that the small town of Bastogne, a road junction surrounded by paratroopers without winter clothing, was about to be encircled by 4 German divisions. He said one of them was going to have to attack north, hit the southern flank of the German Bulge, punch through to relieve Bastogne before the paratroopers ran out of ammunition. He looked at Patton. When can you attack? Every general in the room knew what attacking north meant. It meant turning Patton's Third Army 90 degrees on its axis. It meant pulling 3 full divisions out of contact with the enemy on the eastern front and moving them more than 100 miles north in winter on roads that were sheets of ice against a German salient that was still growing. It meant doing in days what military doctrine said should take weeks. The room was silent. Patton looked at the map. He said on December 22nd, with 3 divisions. Several officers in the room exchanged looks. They thought Patton was bluffing. He was not bluffing. Eisenhower asked if he was sure. Patton said yes, 3 divisions, 48 hours. What none of the other generals in the room understood was that Patton was not making a wild promise. He was not bluffing because he did not need to bluff. He had chosen the number 48 hours not because it sounded impressive. He had chosen it because it was approximately the amount of time he calculated would be needed to execute a plan that had already, in part, been done. Patton had ordered planning the moment General Bradley first telephoned with news of the German attack. That had been 3 days earlier, on December 16th, with the German offensive still in its first hours. Within minutes, Patton had pulled in his Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay. Within an hour, Gay had pulled in his cavalry reconnaissance squadrons. He had given them a single instruction: find me the roads. The jeeps had gone out. They had driven north through the cold, in pairs and threes, ranging across the territory that would become the Third Army's axis of advance. They had measured the bridges. They had marked the choke points. They had identified German positions, observed their strength, mapped their orientation. They had driven the road from Arles to Bastogne in conditions so bad that branches scraped both sides of the vehicles at once. And they had radioed back what they found in a code that the Germans never broke. By the morning of December 19th, while Patton was sitting in that small room at Verdun looking calmly at a map, the work had already been done. The reconnaissance was complete. The bridges were measured, the German positions were known, the choke points were marked, the radio frequencies were assigned, the supply routes were identified. The logistics tables had been drafted in pencil at Third Army headquarters the day before by men who knew that an order was coming and had decided not to wait for it. When Patton said 48 hours, he was not making a promise, he was confirming a status report. The Third Army was not going to begin moving when the order was given. It was already moving. The order would simply make it official. This is the part of the story that the history books underplay, because it does not flatter the great man theory of history. Patton did not move Third Army by force of personality alone. He moved it because the system underneath him had been built by Karl Probst's drafting pencil 4 years earlier, and because 1,000 sergeants and lieutenants in jeeps had already made the decisions that allowed the order to be possible. The 90-degree turn began at dawn on December 20th. By the morning of December 22nd, 3 Third Army divisions, more than 50,000 men with vehicles and supplies, were attacking north into the German flank. It was the largest and fastest reorientation of a field army in the history of warfare. The 4th Armoured Division led the way, December 22nd, temperatures well below zero. The 4th Armoured moved north from Arles, Belgium, 3 columns abreast on 3 parallel roads, 15 miles of frozen ground between them and the encircled paratroopers in Bastogne. Surrounding that perimeter, 4 German divisions and elements of 3 Panzer Corps, approximately 45,000 men with tanks, artillery and anti-aircraft guns repositioned as ground weapons. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division had been holding for 6 days. They were out of medical supplies. They were running low on ammunition. The German commander had just delivered a formal written demand for the Americans to surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, 46 years old, the acting commander of the 101st in the absence of his division commander, had responded in writing with a single word. Nuts! What happened in the next 96 hours was not ahead of the 4th Armoured Tank columns, it was the jeeps. The reconnaissance teams from the 25th Cavalry Squadron rode ahead of the tanks. 12 vehicles, 24 men, through forest roads so narrow that snow-laden branches scraped both sides of the jeep at once, visibility less than 30 yards. They carried no heavy weapons. Their only protection was speed, and the fact that no German commander had yet admitted to his superiors that American jeeps were operating this far behind the forward line. They found the first German position near Chaumont at 7:40 in the morning. 4 anti-tank guns on a ridge overlooking the road. The lead jeep stopped. The observer picked up his handset. He read coordinates. He spoke quietly, precisely, like a man ordering coffee. 4 minutes later, a battalion of 105mm howitzers opened fire simultaneously. The ridge disappeared in smoke and frozen earth. The column moved forward. They found the second position near Remy-Champagne. This was larger. A battalion defensive line with interlocking fields of fire designed to stop exactly the kind of armoured assault coming down the road. Under normal circumstances, this would have required an infantry assault, artillery preparation lasting hours, flanking movements coordinated at regimental level. Under normal circumstances, this would have taken most of a day. An observer in a jeep drove a farm track through the trees on the eastern flank. He was not supposed to be there. The track was not on any military map. One of his men had found it by driving until the trees thinned and then following the gap. From the edge of the tree line, he could see the entire German position spread out below him. He could see the gun pits, he could see the ammunition carts, he could see the command post identified by the antenna cluster above it. He called it all in. Grid by grid, position by position. Artillery fired for 11 minutes. When the 4th Armored Tanks reached the German line, they found abandoned vehicles and equipment scattered across 300 yards of snow. The defenders who had survived the artillery had withdrawn into the forest. The ones who had not were where they fell. The battalion that was supposed to hold that position for 24 hours had held it for 11 minutes of fire and 10 minutes of decision. December 26, 1944, 4:45 in the afternoon. Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armoured Division, broke through the German encirclement on the road into Bastogne. A Sherman tank commander, 1st Lieutenant Charles Boggess, opened his hatch and shouted across the snow to a figure in a foxhole. The figure shouted back in American English. The siege of Bastogne was over. Patton had delivered exactly what he had promised at Verdun: 3 divisions, a 90-degree turn, 48 hours from order to movement, 6 days from movement to breakthrough. 100 miles of frozen roads fought through in conditions that German planning had deemed impassable for a major offensive. A soldier from the 101st Airborne, who had been inside the perimeter for 7 days later, described the moment the relief column arrived. He said, "We heard the tanks before we saw them. Then we saw the jeeps running ahead, and we knew, because the jeeps were always first. The Ardennes offensive collapsed in the weeks that followed." The German army would never again mount a major offensive in the West. By March of 1945, American forces were across the Rhine. By April, they were 200 miles inside Germany. By May 7th, the war in Europe was over. In the months after the surrender, American army historians sat down with captured German prisoners in cold interrogation rooms across occupied Germany. They asked questions about doctrine, about tactics, about the choices that had been made in the final years of the war. And buried inside thousands of pages of transcripts, the same answer appeared again and again, from generals, from colonels, from privates, all of them giving variations of the same sentence. We never knew where the Americans were. The Americans always knew where we were. That asymmetry, one side seeing, one side blind, it was not a coincidence of terrain or weather. It was a structural feature of a system built around 640,000 small vehicles with radios, driven by men who had the authority to act on what they saw. And then, in the spring of 1948, in a hearing room in Washington, D.C., something happened that almost no American paid attention to, but that mattered to one man in particular. The Federal Trade Commission of the United States issued a formal ruling. The commission found that the Willys Overland Motor Company had engaged in false advertising by claiming, in its post-war marketing campaigns, that Willys engineers had designed the Jeep. The ruling stated that the original design had been the work of others, specifically the American Bantam Car Company and an engineer named Karl Probst. The commission ordered Willys to stop the false claims. Bantam, by then, was no longer making vehicles. The company that had won the competition delivered the prototype and watched its design walk down the road to Toledo, had received its consolation contract for trailers, made what money it could, and shut down its automobile operations. Within a few years, the company itself would be absorbed into a larger steel concern and would cease to exist as an independent business. Karl Probst did not file the complaint. The complaint had been filed by Bantam years earlier. By 1948, Karl Probst was 64 years old, working freelance again in Detroit, taking the contracts he had always taken. The FTC ruling did not bring him any money. It did not bring him a job. It did not bring him a medal. It mentioned his name in a few paragraphs of a federal document, and that was all. He did not give interviews about the ruling. He did not write a memoir about it. He did not, so far as anyone can determine, ever speak publicly about the Jeep at all. He lived another 15 years. He worked. He kept his head down. He went home at night to a quiet life that the historical record does not preserve in detail. On June 19, 1963, in Detroit, Michigan, Karl Probst died. He was nearly 80 years old. The obituary, when it appeared, was short. It mentioned his work as an engineer. It mentioned that he had designed the Bantam prototype that became the Jeep. It did not say much more than that. There was no ceremony. There was no folded flag. There was no representative of the United States government at the funeral. The man who had drawn in 2 days on a borrowed ball in a borrowed office the vehicle that German generals named ahead of every other American weapon when they were asked which had impressed them most. The man whose design had been built 640,000 times and had landed on every continent where the war was fought. The man who had compressed the time of an entire army and made possible the destruction of the Third Reich's defensive nervous system. He died the way he had lived, quietly, as an engineer. And here is the thing that those of you who lived through that war, or whose fathers and grandfathers lived through it, already understand. Karl Probst was not a hero. He himself would have rejected the word. He was a craftsman. He was given a problem. He solved it. The solution worked beyond any reasonable expectation. He took the money he was offered, which was small. He went back to the work he had always done. The Jeep belongs to him in the same way that every great American achievement belongs to the men who built it, not to the politicians who took credit, not to the corporations that put their logos on it, to the engineers, to the welders, to the privates and the sergeants, to the lieutenants on the ridge with the binoculars and the radio, to the medics driving wounded boys to aid stations in the back of a vehicle that had no roof, to the cavalry scouts who drove the road from Arlon to Bastogne in the worst weather Europe had seen in 30 years. They built it together, they drove it together, they won the war with it together, and the man who drew it first sat at a borrowed table in a small Pennsylvania town in the summer of 1940 and did the work because someone called and asked him if he could help. That is the story of the Jeep. That is the story of how a vehicle with no armor and no gun ended up at the top of every German general's list when the war was over. It was not the steel, it was not the engine, it was not the four-wheel drive that could climb a hill, it was the man with the radio. And the man who built the machine that put him there.